Hey there, welcome to episode 132 of Mike's Collection. I'm Mike, and the part of my collection that I'm going to be talking about today is Masters of the Universe Origins, Wave 2. Now, I've done something a little different with this video. If you watched my Wave 1 review, I had originally started out with that video intending to review my entire Masters of the Universe Origins collection. But as often happens to me, I sit down, I shoot these intros, and I tell you everything I intend to do. Like, I'm going to review all these figures, and this video is going to be short. It's only going to be half an hour. And then I talk too much, and my video goes long. I don't end up showing you everything I told you I was going to show you in the intro, or my video ends up being an hour plus. So anyway, what I did this time around is I already shot my review of Wave 2 and Wave 3. They're separate videos. They are about a half hour long each, and now I'm shooting the intros. So now I can promise you right off the bat that this video is only going to be about a half hour long, no longer, and I promise that I fit all four figures of Wave 2 into this one video. So for all the background on Masters of the Universe and anything like that, the history of the Origins line, I recommend you go check out my first video, the review of Wave 1. But just in case you didn't watch that, basically what I'm doing is I'm going through these figures one at a time. I'm not spending a ton of time going about the articulation of each character, because the articulation is pretty much the same across the board. Mostly what I'm doing is kind of giving my thoughts on the character, my background with the character. Did I have this toy as a kid? Did I not? And comparing it to the other versions of these characters that I have in my collection. So having said that, we're only about 2 minutes in. So we're making good time. So let's keep this at around 30 minutes. Let's just dive right into reviewing the toys. So the first figure we're going to look at in Wave 2 of Masters of the Universe Origins is the heroic character Manny Faces. Now, this was a character that I didn't have the original vintage figure in the 80s, but my brother Doug did. So I can't show you the original one as a comparison here, but this figure here looks very close to it. I would say the colors are a little brighter, and just from memory, some of these, the paint doesn't feel as detailed. Not that the vintage figures were all that detailed with their paint, but I feel like maybe there was a little bit more detail throughout some of the blue here. I don't know, but I think the biggest difference is probably the brighter colors and some of the softer sculpting in the face. So Manny Faces is kind of a weird character, because if you look at his face here, so this is his flesh tone, so he's like a human character. And then this implies that he's like bare chested and bare armed, and he's wearing these little shorts and bare legs. So I guess, he's, for all intents and purposes, he's quite exposed with just these kind of random bits of armor on there, which doesn't seem like a great idea for going into battle. He's got a little pistol, which I think is pretty similar to the gun that the vintage toy had. Since this is the first figure we're talking about in this video, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the articulation again. I talked a little bit about it in my video for Wave 1. But basically, these figures look a lot like the vintage toys, except with the increased articulation of their ankles move forward and back and rock side to side. They have knees that they never had before, so they can stand a little bit taller, or you can kind of squat them so they can be in the position they were in the vintage toy line. They still spin at the waist, but it doesn't swing, doesn't snap back in place like the vintage toys did. They have ball jointed shoulders, so they've got a good range of movement as opposed to the vintage figures who just move forward and backwards. They've got elbows, which the vintage figures did not have, so you can bend their arms. And the wrist forward, backwards, side to side, swivel. And most characters, the heads, do a full kind of 360 because they're on the ball joint. Manny Faces doesn't do that because his gimmick prevents that. So if you're not familiar with Manny Faces, the name, like with a lot of He-Man characters, is pretty cheesy and pretty right on the nose. This guy's name is Man-E-Faces because he has many faces. So his first face is the humanoid face. You turn this little knob on the top, just like the vintage toy, and now he's got a robot face. And you twist it again, and now he's got a monster face. And I will say, these faces all look pretty true to the vintage figure from what I recall, especially the human and the robot face, but this monster face definitely seems like softer. Like there's not much detail. It's kind of hard to even tell what's going on with his mouth there. Like I think he's supposed to have this underbite, but yeah, it's just kind of a green mush. He almost looks like a slime monster. So I definitely remember the sculpt being a little firmer on the vintage figure. But I don't dislike this. It's kind of interesting in its own way. So yeah, Manny Faces is cool, but as I mentioned before, it is a little weird knowing that this is his flesh tone. So he's still got this like human skin with this monster face or with this robot face. It just seems a little odd. It would have made more sense like if the rest of his armor was all colored purple, all these like flesh tone parts, then you wouldn't necessarily know what his body looked like under there. But yeah, just a weird choice for whoever designed him. But that's kind of par for the course with Masters of the Universe. A lot of weird designs. So I don't have the vintage one to show you, as I said. But what I do have is the 2002 version of Manny Faces here. So, like with the 2002 figures I showed you in the first video, these ones are a little bit more anime inspired. They're a little bigger, they have a lot more detail. They were sculpted by the Four Horsemen, who are some famous toy sculptors who give us just amazing toys. So you can definitely see how they took the original design and ran with it, but it's still very true to the original. Even the gun is similar in shape, even though it's way oversized now and has a projectile weapon. But yeah, still looks pretty cool. The flesh tone of his face, very orange, but matches up here. You can see he's got like nipples and veins on his arms here, so this is definitely his exposed skin. But they did change it up on his legs, so he doesn't have exposed skin there anymore, which I think was a good choice. But then if you look at his back here, that's a little different from the vintage toy and the Origins figure in that those details are all painted, but here, like, it looks like his flesh tone just turns kind of robotic. It kind of implies he's maybe more of a cyborg on this version. I don't know, kind of strange, but I dig this character anyway. His little face function here works the same. You turn it, there's a monster face. You can see on this one how that face is a little bit more defined. And one more spin, and he's got his robot face. A little more detail on this version as well. So there we go. There's a couple of Manny Faces. Now I do have the classics Manny Faces that came out around, say, 2010 or so. So this is him here, and this is a great figure. Takes all the design elements of the original vintage toy, but just kind of amps them up. Makes for a more detailed, more articulated, just a cool figure. And you can see human face, robot face, monster face. So it looks pretty much the same on every iteration. And then the last Manny Faces I have here to show you is the Filmation, which is based on the old cartoon. And so here's this guy. And I'm a little torn here. Usually, like with some of the previous Filmation figures I showed you in the last video, such as He-Man and Skeletor and Man-at-Arms, I think the Filmation versions are the best versions of those characters. As much as I might like the classics design, there's just something about the animated look that is so iconic. With Manny Faces here, he's obviously not nearly as iconic as a character as He-Man and Skeletor. He didn't appear in nearly as many episodes, so his cartoon look isn't necessarily so iconic, and it doesn't necessarily, speak to me as the definitive version of the character. I'm probably more familiar with the toy than I am with him in the cartoon. So I love both of these figures, but I'm hard-pressed to say which one I like more. But you can see this guy here, because he's matching the animation model, he's lacking a lot of these like little details here in his armor, because that would have been a pain in the ass for the animators to draw. So he's much more streamlined. His helmet, very simple, smooth, doesn't have all this gadgets and lines and stuff on it. Now his face does spin as well, but he doesn't have a knob, so it's a little awkward. You have to get your fingers in there and push his face around, which that worked okay. There's his robot face. And there's his monster face. Sometimes it's a bit of a struggle to turn this thing and get it to land where you want. But there you go. So that is my little army of Manny Faces. And yeah, this Origins figure I think is awesome. I really like him. So there you go. Let's move on to the next guy. So next up we have Orko. So Orko is kind of the cutesy little character that seemed like every cartoon had to have. And it's not like the cartoon was lacking in comic relief anyway. Most of Skeletor's henchmen were kind of bumbling buffoons, and there was Battle Cat when he was Cringer, was kind of a wimp, and so he generated comedy. So we didn't necessarily need Orko to lighten the mood, but that's largely what he was there for in the old cartoon, and I was not really a fan of him. I did not have the vintage toy, neither did my brother. And it was kind of weird from what I recall, like he seemed kind of out of scale, because if memory serves, he was about as tall as the other He-Man figures. Now, obviously, he lacked the little squatty body that most He-Man figures had. I think he was on wheels, actually. So he had his little cloak like this, and then at the bottom were some wheels. So he stood about as tall as a vintage He-Man figure and just rolled around. And he looked rather rigid, like his cloak was kind of just a triangle. Again, I'm going to stick a picture in here for you to see it, but and maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but that seems to be what I remember. Anyway, this Orko here is a vast improvement over the vintage toy. So I'm kind of glad they didn't stick too slavishly to the original design. So this guy here, he's smaller than the other figures, which is nice. So if I bring in another figure here, you can see this is a little more accurate to the cartoon in that he's not the same height as the guy. He pretty much is the same height for his head, but he's floating here. They've got this little clear arm to make it look like he's floating or flying. So that's really cool. So if we get in close, you can see his head is just this little black circle. And I don't know if they ever really showed Orko without his hat and his scarf on. I would assume he would have like a little blue face rather than the black ball. But he was always kind of hidden away like Marvin the Martian. And it kind of makes you wonder, is his face really just a black circle? Or is it all just supposed to be shadowed, which is what I always assumed it was. But when you look at this figure up close, you can clearly see it's just a big black circle for his face. But it looks very accurate to the cartoon. Looks great. So his articulation here, he's got a ball-jointed head, so that moves all around. I don't think the vintage figure had much articulation at all. He's got ball-jointed shoulders, elbows, his wrists turn and bend, and then obviously no leg articulation. But you can take him off of this arm, so if you wanted to just set him on the ground or have him float around manually yourself, you could do that. But they give you this optional arm, and it's articulated as well, so you can lean him forward, lean him back, side to side. So there's lots of different poses with that, so that's really cool. And it attaches to this pretty big translucent purple base, which gives him a pretty strong base from which he won't tip over if you lean him to the side. So that's all really cool too. And I guess this is just supposed to represent kind of a plume of purple smoke or magic or something. I don't know what else you could do. You maybe could have put some green stones like Castle Grayskull or something, but I think this works pretty well. Now for comparisons, so no vintage figure, but I will bring out the first figure to do this kind of effect, which was the 2002 figure. And this was the first time that I thought they made Orko kind of cool. He was still pretty goofy in the cartoon, but this toy really kind of makes him look a little more interesting, at least. I don't know if I'd say cool, but he looks more interesting. A lot more detailed. So you can see here he is floating. He doesn't have any legs. This soft skirt is like hollow. And he plugs into this translucent base of smoke, which makes it allow him to look like he's floating along the ground, which is really cool. He is articulated at the waist, the arms, the hands, and turns at the head. And yeah, pretty cool figure. I like this guy a lot. You can definitely see, all the folds and the cape and everything. It's really well done. So I like this figure a lot. And then when the Classics figures came out, and this again, I'm not sure the exact year, 2010, 2011, we got Orko, and he was actually packaged with Prince Adam. But here is the Classics Orko. So this one is probably the most accurate to the cartoon. Like as far as size goes, like he's quite small when compared to the other classics figures. Like he's smaller than even these figures. And both of these lines, the main characters were smaller. So classics were the biggest version of He-Man, and yet the Orko was the smallest version of Orko that we have. So when you can see them all side to side here, he's pretty small. Now he's got this really tall base, which allows him to kind of look eye to eye with the classics version of He-Man, which is cool. But you can see the base they gave him, it's not nearly as broad as the one on the Origins figure, so you have to worry about him tipping over all the time. And there's not much posability. You can turn that thing around, but it can't lean forward, backwards, that sort of thing. So that's kind of unfortunate. And you have to be careful when you're displaying him. And as for the colors, you can see this guy is much darker, very dark purple there. I think the Origins one probably looks the best as far as the colors go. As I've been talking about with a lot of the Origins figures, they look more like toys, like they're brighter, they're funner. And yeah, there was a time when I wanted ultra detailed, and that's kind of what I got with some of these other lines. But now with Origins, I'm looking for something a little different, and I like what they're doing with their just kind of bright colored fun figures. So yeah, even though Orko is by far not my favorite Masters of the Universe character, I think this Origins figure is a home run. So Wave 2 provided us with 2 heroic characters with Manny Faces and Orko, and they also gave us 2 villainous characters, the first one here being Scareglow. Now, Scareglow, he's one of Skeletor's henchmen, I suppose. I don't know a whole lot about Scareglow. He was in the vintage line, but he was released kind of late in the line, and as a kid, my interest was kind of waning by that point, and me and my brother weren't collecting too many of the figures. So neither of us had Scareglow. He's a cool looking figure. You can tell like this one is, again, a pretty good recreation of the vintage toy. So you see what you got here. He's a skeleton guy in a purple cape with his big green axe. So yeah, he's cool. And maybe the only reason why I didn't feel like the need to run out and get him when I was a kid is because he's kind of similar to Skeletor. Like, it seems like kind of a weird choice. Like, I'm glad Scareglow exists, but when your main villain is this skeleton guy with a yellow face, and then you give him a bunch of henchmen like a gorilla man and a sea creature man and a crab guy, like you've got all kinds of weird henchmen. You can pick anything under the sun because there's no real rules in Masters of the Universe, and yet they make one of his henchmen another skeleton with another kind of yellowy face. And that might make sense if they made like some characters, like some ties between the two characters. Like if they said Scareglow was Skeletor's brother or something, then that would make more sense. But as far as I know, there's no real connection between Scareglow and Skeletor. His origin was never really fleshed out because he never appeared in the cartoons, I'm pretty sure. So any origin story he has now was kind of fleshed out in more recent years on things like the file card on the back of his classics figure and maybe some of the more modern comic books. He did recently appear in the He-Man Revelations cartoon on Netflix, so it was kind of cool to get to see this guy in animation for the first time. So, I don't have the vintage figure to show you, but we'll bring this guy up here. So, he's made of this kind of, it's not really translucent plastic here, but, I guess I was going to maybe save it as a surprise, but you probably are aware, Scareglow glows in the dark. That's his gimmick now, that was his gimmick then, and it's always been his gimmick. So that's why he's cast in this kind of strange looking plastic, because it is glow in the dark plastic. And then he's got these, it's not like he has a skeleton painted over the body, it's more like he has the gaps in the skeleton painted over it in black. So, very cool. The design is pretty simple. The cape is removable. No bones on the back. That's pretty strange. I don't know if that's accurate to the vintage figure as well, but yeah, that's kind of odd. Head design looks great. It's simple, limited paint apps, but that's really all you need. The axe, very similar to what he had in the vintage line. And yeah, looks cool. Now, I don't have the vintage figure to show you. And Scareglow never appeared in the 2002 toy line either. And since he was never in the Filmation cartoon, he didn't get a Filmation version of his figure. So he does have some new versions now. Like, they just made a new version of him based on the Revelations cartoon, which I don't have. And I'm not sure if I will get. I'm not really planning on collecting the Revelations figures. Anyway, the only figure I have here to show you for comparison is the Classics version, and it's a pretty great figure. So you can see the similarities, but anytime you're dealing with Classics, they're just a little bit more detailed. They go that little one extra step. So with his eyes, instead of just being black holes, they get some red and some yellow paint apps in there too. Great paint apps on his teeth. So rather than just give us that little stitchy line on his mouth, they've actually given us the detail around the shape of his teeth. Looks really cool. The cloak is nice and detailed. Oddly enough, the cloak is less detailed than the Origins figure. This one is smooth. It's got kind of a translucency to it. But I don't know which is more accurate to the vintage figure, if it was smooth like this or if it was textured the way this guy is. You know what? Actually, now that I think about it, I think the vintage figure might have had a cloth cape. Yeah, I don't know. You guys know because I just would have shared a picture of it probably a couple of minutes ago. So yeah, I'm thinking it might have been a soft goods cape. So really, neither one of these is accurate to the vintage figure if that was the case. And I'm hard to say which one I like more. I like the color of this one more for this particular figure. It's nice and dark and kind of creepy. But with this guy, I like the brighter purple on it, and I do like the texture that makes it look like material. So yeah, very cool. This guy also came with his green axe. I don't have him displayed with it. Instead, I have him displayed with his other weird accessory he had, which was like the key to Castle Grayskull, and it's handcuffed to his hand. That was kind of a neat little bonus accessory. So I think that's all I have to say about Scareglow. But before I cut away, I am going to flick the lights off here and see if I can get these guys to glow on screen for you. So here are the Scareglows glowing. Hopefully they get picked up on camera okay. It looks to me like the Origins guy is glowing quite well. The Classics one, not so much. But I think that's probably because the Origins guy has been in front of my ring light for a few minutes longer than the Classics one. But both of them, when exposed to enough light, glow quite well, and they look pretty cool. So the last figure we have to look at in Wave 2 is Trapjaw. Now, Trapjaw is a really cool character, one of Skeletor's evil warriors, and I don't have the vintage figure here to show you. I never owned it, but my brother Doug did. Trapjaw was his all-time favorite Masters of the Universe character, so he was very well used when we played with our He-Man figures when we were young. I talked about this a little bit in the first video, but me and Doug, we collected everything together. So whether it was G.I. Joe or He-Man or whatever, I bought half the characters and he bought half the characters, and we played together, like side by side. And, we got along great. We never really interfered. It's not like I would suddenly reach over and slap Trapjaw to the ground and say, your character's dead or anything. We played collaboratively. So where Merman was my favorite character, Trapjaw was his favorite character, they would often kind of be the stars of the show sometimes. So even though Trapjaw is my brother's favorite, by default he's kind of one of my favorites because he was always palling around with Merman when we played with our toys. Anyway, this is a really cool figure. He looks like the vintage figure, with probably the biggest differences being the bright colors and the soft detail in the face. Now, it's been a long time since I've had the vintage figure in front of me, but I do seem to recall his face having a little bit more detail than what we're seeing here. Like, this is a very soft sculpt in his face there. But anyway, he looks great. He's still got the skull and crossbones there. His legs, I believe he's got the same legs as Manny Faces here, which was the case with the vintage toy line. A lot of the times they reused parts. So when you had like a character that was kind of a cyborg or futuristic like this, why not use the same legs? So yeah, it works out well. Now, the biggest difference with Trapjaw, he's got this big belt, which was detachable, instead of, most guys had like a harness or something, but he's just got this belt. And then he's also got this shoulder piece, which could be, it was removable on the vintage figure. I think it's part of the sculpt here. And then he's got this one mechanical arm. Now, I don't know if they ever went into why he has a mechanical arm in the old cartoons or comic books, but they have fleshed that out in some of the more modern comic books, where Skeletor actually took this guy and beat his jaw off and ripped his arm off and really mutilated him, and then he had to become a cyborg to become Trapjaw. So, he has got this robotic arm, which is really cool. Now, it doesn't have a ball joint, so where his arm can move out like that, the vintage figure couldn't do this with this arm. It can only move forward, backward. So with this one here, this arm moves like the vintage figure. It can only move forward, backward. It does not have a way to move outward. But I think it does have this extra joint of articulation in the elbow, which the vintage one would not have had. And then he has the interchangeable hands, just like the vintage figure did. So here I've got him displayed with his laser cannon, but you can pop that out. And what's really cool is he's got storage on his belt for the extra parts. So you can put his claw hand or his hook hand and plug them in there. And same thing, if you don't want to use the gun, it's got a little clip on there as well, so you could clip that onto the belt. But I happen to like the laser gun. It seems to be the most effective weapon, so that's how I display him. Now you also see here his jaw popped open. So that's kind of a unique piece of articulation for Trapjaw. So his mouth opens and closes, so that's really cool. That's just like the vintage figure as well. Inside his mouth, it's just kind of this black void. Nothing to really see there. He's always had this little, I don't know what you'd call that on the top of his helmet. It seems a little strange, but I think the idea behind it on the vintage figure was that you could tie like some string between your bedposts and run the string through his head, and he could zip line down the string. So I don't think he ever did that in the cartoon or anything. So yeah, I don't even recall if that was a feature that was advertised on its packaging or not. But I think that was the idea behind that. Anyway, I really like this Trapjaw figure. And even with the soft expression in his face there, or the soft sculpt at least, I actually do find it has still a pretty good expression on it. Like, he still looks pissed off, even though it's not like super detailed. Anyway, great figure. Don't have the vintage guy to show you, but I do have the 2002 Four Horsemen sculpted version. So you can see this guy here is much more gnarly. He's got a lot of scars with stitches and stuff throughout his body, his face. If you open up his jaw there, that kind of snaps shut. But his face is just a lot more detailed, a lot more lines and wrinkles throughout. His mechanical arm was this really big, grotesque thing. It kind of hangs right down to the ground. And it also had additional attachments. I've got it displayed with this big kind of claw hook thing. But yeah, otherwise, all the other elements, the belt with the skull and crossbones, the legs that he shares with Manny Faces, and so he had the same legs as the Manny Faces from the 2002 line. But yeah, lots of cool details. But you can see that he stayed pretty true to the original design. Now, they did do a Filmation version of Trapjaw. I never got that one. Unfortunately, when the Filmation figures first launched, they were very hard to get. They sold out immediately. So I missed out on a bunch of key characters like He-Man, Skeletor, Beastman, and Trapjaw. Now, fortunately, when Super 7 took over the license from Mattel, they re-released He-Man and Skeletor. That's why I was able to get them. But they did not re-release Beastman or Trapjaw, so unfortunately never got them. But I do have the Classics version of Trapjaw. They did release a couple of versions of him in Classics, one of them based on his look in the mini comics, where he was like shirtless and had these striped shorts. But the version I have is the more traditional version based on the vintage toy. So again, you can see the similarities right across the board, from the cyborgy legs to the belt buckle, the mechanical arm, all that stuff. The color scheme is pretty consistent throughout. Now, one major difference with this figure is he's even a little gnarlier than this one, in that when you open his mouth, you see this kind of like gory, fleshy bit hanging there, which is pretty gross. So, Yeah, usually the Classics line steered away from gore, but I guess they could kind of hide it away in his jaw there, so that's kind of a neat little add-on. But otherwise, pretty cool, pretty similar. Like this character a lot. I'm glad that we got him early on in the Origins line. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about this guy. So that is my review of Masters of the Universe Origins Wave 2. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to hit the like button, the subscribe button, leave me comments below. That's always appreciated. And I can guarantee you that there will be another video up for Wave 3 very soon, because I've already shot it. So I'll probably post that in maybe 2 days or so, just to give you a little bit of a break between videos. And then I'll quickly follow that up with videos for Wave 4, Wave 5, and then the deluxe figures. So yeah, a few more to go. Anyway, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.